So as I'm filming now, it's the end of October 2020. So at the heart of this build is the NCase M1 version 6.1. This has been recommended by lots of YouTubers and different forums about small form factor PCs, based on its really good airflow, the looks, the build quality, and how easy it is to build. Okay, in terms of motherboard, I've got the ROG STRIX B550i Gaming. Out the box, it's compatible with the new AMD Ryzen Zen 3 chips coming out in November, and it's obviously compatible with the GPUs coming out from AMD and NVIDIA at the end of 2020. Okay, so now moving on to this part here. So we've got the Noctua NHU9S CPU cooler. This CPU cooler's got great reviews when used in conjunction with this case, and it should hopefully keep it as quiet as possible. And continuing with the theme of cooling, I've got a selection of Noctua NF-A12 case fans. Okay, so in terms of storage, I've got a 1TB M.2 SSD by Western Digital. Not really much to say here. I've heard good reviews about this. It's meant to be very fast. Here I've got 32GB of crucial Ballistix RAM. So this is 3600MHz CL16, so it's going to be really fast. Okay, so the last big box I've got here is the power supply. It's the Corsair SF750. Some YouTubers have suggested that we don't actually need a power supply that big, and Optimum Tech has done a lot of videos about undervolting and potentially the savings in power that we can have there. But I went ahead and bought the SF750 anyway, mostly because I want to try and keep this PC as future-proof as possible. So you might be wondering, where are the two most important parts of this build? CPU and the GPU. With the CPU, I've got this here. I've got a Ryzen 5 2600. So at the time of buying all the rest of the parts, there was a bit of a lack of availability in current Zen 2 chips by AMD. I'm not totally convinced by the lineup of new Zen 3 chips, and I think I'm going to wait until 2021 to see if they come out with any non-X chips or slightly cheaper versions. And lastly, the GPU. So this is a funny story. So on launch day at 2 PM, I sat on my computer and I made a pre-order for an EVGA XC3 Black Edition. Fast forward just under 7 weeks later, and I've moved in a queue from position 47 to 44. So at that rate, I'm probably going to get my RTX 3080 in 2022. We'll see if that card actually gets delivered on time, but yeah, I'm hoping it does. And if it doesn't, then I've got Big Navi coming just around the corner on November the 18th, and hopefully they'll have some kind of stock. Okay, so that's all the parts going into this new computer. I'm going to get started with the build now, and yeah, I hope you enjoy watching it. To avoid confusion when you're following the guide, this is the top, bottom, back and front sides of the case. For the left and right side, you have to imagine that you're looking from the back of the case. Some of that might seem obvious, but the left and right side depend on what perspective you're looking at. First step is take off all the exterior aluminium panels, and you've got two magnetic dust filters, one on the bottom and one on the right hand side of the case. So you just take them off and keep them to the side. Okay, we're going to start on the left hand side of the case to begin with. First thing is to take the power supply bracket off. In blue is the bracket, and in red, 3 bolts that you need to take out. So just go ahead and take those bolts out and try to support the power supply bracket and not let it fall like I did. Okay, moving over to the right side of the case, we're going to take off this bracket next. So there's 4 fixings, 2 at the front and 2 at the back. This bracket's normally used to mount a radiator if you're doing a liquid cooled build. My build is only air cooled, and I'll be mounting 1 extra case fan onto this bracket later in the build. You can just keep this off to the side for now. You can take that brown paper out that comes with the case, and I'm kind of just keeping those cables out of the way for the moment. Okay, next step is to take the NCase M1 badge off by removing these 2 bolts, and just keep this in a safe place. And next we remove the power supply cable that comes with the case, again removing the 2 bolts, and just remove the cable. Keep it to the side. Next I'm going to be fitting the fans in the bottom. For this build I'm going to use NF-A12 25s. so the 25mm fan. I also have some 15mm fans. In the NCase M1 V6, you can fit up to 2 slot graphics card for the 25mm fan and up to 2.5 slot for the 15mm fan. The way I fit these case fans means that they exhaust out the bottom of the case. Now I found when testing that you get better cooling performance if you have them intake from the bottom. When following this guide, make sure that the sticker points up towards the top of the case if you want the fans to intake from the bottom. The rest of the steps to fit the fans are the same in this guide. Start by making sure that these cables are facing towards the left hand side of the case. So there's a few positions that you can fit the case fans on the bottom part of the frame of the case. If you fit them too far in that direction, they can be quite tight on the I/O cables at the front of the case. So I fit them just as far back as they go. There's some extra holes there in the bottom of the frame, and it just gives you a lot more room for these cables at the front of the case. Okay, before fitting the fans into the case, you want to pre-tap the holes. If you don't know what this is, pre-tapping is basically just creating a thread within the plastic. So when it comes to fitting them in the case, it's easier. So you can see here, I'm just turning the screw with my finger because I've already pre-tapped the hole and created a thread. In the box with these Noctua fans, you get these chunky self-tapping screws, which you can use to pre-tap the holes in the fan. So to do it, you just tighten the screw into the hole as far as it will go and then take it out, and then you've got your pre-tapped hole. So you see that. So now you need to turn the case upside down and you can fit the 2 fans into the bottom of the case. At each corner of the fan there's a brown rubber seal. You want to get some compression on the rubber, but don't tighten it too much or else you could strip the threads on the fans. Okay, next we're going to fit the I/O shield into the back of the case. This is pretty easy, just make sure you get the shield the right way up. Okay, this is where it gets a bit more interesting. We want to get the motherboard out. We're going to start by fitting the CPU. So first thing you want to do is look for this mark or a similar mark on your motherboard. There will be a corresponding mark on your CPU and you just line them up, drop it in. It shouldn't take any force to drop the CPU in. You just lower the lever and there you can see there's the mark on the CPU that corresponds with the one on the motherboard. So these are the mounts for the CPU cooler. I've actually already fitted them at this point because I had to do a clearance check to make sure that the RAM fitted okay. The instructions come with the box for the CPU cooler. Speaking of RAM, that's what we're going to fit next. So these should just click in place. There's a million tutorials about how to fit RAM on YouTube, so I won't go into too much detail. Next we're going to fit the M.2 SSD. So there's a long screw here that needs to come out, and then there's a smaller screw on the other side of this SSD cover. You need quite a small screwdriver, Phillips head. So you get your SSD out. I still can't believe how small these are compared to hard drives from a few years ago, but what we want to do is get this little screw out. This is the one that's used to fix in the M.2 SSD. So we just insert it at an angle to begin with, click it in so it's hard up against the stop, and push it down, and then we just fix it in with that screw that we took out a minute ago. If your motherboard has a cover for the SSD, it might have this heat tape, so you just take the backing off the tape and then you lower it back on. We just want to fit this cover again. Once you have the holes lined up, you can fit the short screw first and then fit the long screw second. Okay, so we're done with the motherboard for now. Put that to one side. You want to find the 2 extension cables that came with the bottom 2 case fans that we just fitted, and we want to open up the power supply box and just take out this bag with the power supply cables because we're going to need them now. We're going to be fitting the 2 ATX power cables to the motherboard. This motherboard has 3 headers for fans. The top one, the grey one, is for the CPU fan, and the bottom two can be used for case fans throughout the case. I'm fitting 3 case fans in this case, including the 2 fans we've already fitted, but there's only 2 spare headers as we've just seen. So I'm going to need to use this Y-splitter on one of the headers. My original plan, and actually what I filmed the first time round, was to fit this into the motherboard and run 2 extension cables out of the Y-splitter. But I actually found that it made the cable routing more difficult, so I decided to fit the Y-splitter at the other end of the extension cable and just run the 2 extension cables directly out of the motherboard like this. They just sit flatter against the back of the motherboard. I hope it makes sense going forward. So what you want to do is get the 2 extension cables that you got earlier, and without the Y-splitter you want to fit them into the 2 black headers. So that's 1 extension cable in each header, and it'll look a bit like this. Okay, back to the motherboard. So we're going to be fitting the 24-pin ATX power cable next. So that one that we looked at earlier, just want to snap that in. In the power supply cable bag, look for the 8-pin ATX power cable. The connector splits into 2 4-pins and says CPU on it. Clip the end of the cable that says CPU into the motherboard 8-pin header. This will deliver power from the power supply unit through the motherboard to the CPU. Okay, let's move the motherboard off to the side and bring the case back in. So we're going to do a bit of cable management before moving on. We've got 2 fan cables here, we're just going to put them off to the side here for just a second. So this cable that looks kind of like a ribbon cable is for the power button. You want to keep this off to the left hand side as well while we're doing some cable management. The rest of the front I/O cables we're going to move to the right hand side of the case, but remember to leave the power button cable in the left hand side. And once you've done that, I'm just taking the fan cables and I'm routing them through the fan blades just to keep the cables out of the way for now and stop them from falling back into the case, because we're going to move the case back onto its side. So the cable should look like this now, and that gives you space to lower the motherboard into the case. Before fitting the motherboard, grab the 2 fan extension cables that come out of the motherboard headers and fold them around the back side of the motherboard. So the 2 fan extension cables will sit flush against the back of the motherboard when you lower it in. And just do the same thing with the 8-pin ATX power cable. Now, while holding the cables, you can begin to lower the motherboard into the case. The next thing we want to do is grab the 8-pin ATX power cable and move it off like this, so it's facing towards the front side of the case behind the motherboard. Now you want to grab the power button ribbon cable, and we're going to route this behind the motherboard as well. So you're going to start from below, and it wants to come out again facing the front of the case. So you can see here in this picture, it's routing around the bottom right mounting hole in the motherboard. From the back of the case, the cable routing should look a bit like this once we've mounted it. Before mounting the motherboard, make sure that the rear I/O for the motherboard are lined up with the I/O shield, and then you can fit the 4 small bolts to fix the motherboard to the frame. Now you've got a chance to turn the case over and have a look at the cable routing behind the motherboard. You've actually got a chance now to tidy up some of the cables, so I actually twisted the ATX power cable so it was just sitting flat. Now for the fan extension cables, because you can see I've used the Y-splitter here on the motherboard end, you can see they don't really sit flat against the motherboard side because of those big connectors. So that's why I ended up just fitting the fan extension cables straight from the motherboard down through and then using the Y-splitter at the other end. And now just having a quick look at the power button ribbon cable, you can see that it's routed below that bottom mounting hole in the motherboard, and then it comes out above the mounting hole on the same side as the ATX power cable. You can actually, I would recommend just pulling this through like I'm doing here. It just means that you effectively lose a bit of the length in the power ribbon cable. Okay, now we're going to fit the HD audio cable from the front I/O. You'll want to check for your motherboard where the connector is for this on your motherboard. For me, there's a small cover that I need to remove and it's just here. So for me, I just remove one screw and then that's it off. And now you have to get that HD audio cable and plug it in. It's a bit tricky with this motherboard and it was quite difficult to film as well, but it should look something like this. It just clips in place and it should look like this. Next we're going to fit the power button cable. Again, this is quite difficult to show and every motherboard will be different, but just check the manual for the motherboard to see how exactly you need to fit this. If you had to take off a cover for the HD audio, just put that back on now. If you're using the front I/O for the NCase M1, you can plug them into the motherboard now as well. So my motherboard has USB 3 and also the USB-C header, so just fit both of them, that's quite easy. There are a few different ways to manage the front I/O cables, but I just moved them off to the front side of the case for now. And I'm actually just putting them through front panel. Okay, we're starting to get towards near the end of the build. We're going to get the power supply unit back in and that power supply mounting bracket that we took off at the start of the build. You want to line it up this way so this long tab is just sitting below the power supply socket and switch. And then find these power supply mounting bolts. These come in one of the small white boxes with the NCase M1. So now fit all the bolts. You can fit them a bit loose to start with and then tighten them all up at the end. Now you want to find the 3 small countersunk bolts that you took out with the power supply bracket at the start of the build. You use these to mount the bracket back in place. Next, grab all the motherboard ATX power cables and you want to just fold them behind the motherboard like this because it makes it easier to fit the power supply unit. So slide the power supply unit in like this so the fan's facing up towards you, and then you can move the ATX power cables back through that gap. Next you want to slide that power supply back up so that the bracket lines back up with the frame. Mine was actually not quite lined up because it was pushing against those cables, so you might have to slide the power supply a little bit to the side. And now we fit those 3 countersunk bolts back in place and the power supply will be fitted to the case now. Now you can get the 24-pin ATX power cable and the 8-pin ATX power cable from the motherboard and clip them into the power supply. You should hear a good click to engage and it should look a bit like this. Next you need to go back to the power supply cable bag and find this cable. So it says type 4 on the connector. This is the PCIe 8-pin which you use to connect the power supply to the GPU. Depending on what GPU you need, you might need 2 cables. I only need 1 cable unless my 3080 eventually arrives. So you just clip it in like that and then I'm getting the other end of it and I'm putting it in this gap underneath the power supply for now until my GPU arrives. This is actually where I decided in the build to switch from the FitY-splitter to 2 fan extension cables from the motherboard. At this point, if it looks like this for you, you want to get that FitY-splitter now and attach it to the end of one of those fan extension cables. So the next thing we need to do is get the fan cables back. So they were through the fan blades. Just be careful when you're pushing them back through the fans that you don't snag on the end of the connector. You want to get these back through, route them back through this hole on the left side of the case again. And now you can just connect them to the FitY-splitter, which you've added to the end of one of those extension cables. The cable management for these is a little bit awkward, but I just tuck them in the gap between the fans and the case on the left hand side. Okay, now flipping the case back over, you want to grab the ATX power cables that you put through that gap again, and I actually just routed them over this side of the power supply, and then you can route the PCIe cable up out of the way as well. Just getting it ready for when you fit the GPU. And make sure that the power cables are sitting in this position so that there's a gap for the GPU to sit in. Next you want to find your thermal paste. My CPU cooler comes with Noctua NTH1 thermal paste, which is actually rated really highly, so I'm quite glad that I got that for free with the CPU cooler. So you want to add some thermal paste onto the centre of the CPU, and now you can grab your CPU cooler and place it on top and just line it up, get it ready to fit. My CPU cooler comes with a little plastic cover on the hot plate, so just make sure you take that off before you place it onto the CPU. And it comes with this handy tool so that you can screw in, and these screws have springs on them as well, so you need to apply a bit of pressure and screw it in. It's a little bit tricky, but don't worry, you'll get there. Okay, so now that the CPU cooler is secured, we're going to get the fan that comes with the CPU cooler. And with the Noctua fans, the same rule applies as before. So the side where the sticker is on is the direction that the air comes out. So you want to attach it with the sticker facing towards the CPU cooler, and make sure that the cable is facing towards the top of the case so that it's easier to plug it into the motherboard header. Once you're ready, just line the fan up, and you can use these clips like this to mount it to the CPU cooler. And now plug the fan cable into the grey header on the motherboard. That's the one that's dedicated for the CPU cooler. So I was just folding this cable down behind this clip to try and manage the top fan cable. Okay, next you want to get this bracket that we took off at the start of the build. You can do a couple of things with this one. If you don't have an extra case fan, you can just leave it as it is and mount it onto the side of the case. But I have another Noctua case fan, so I'm going to mount this onto the bracket. If you're fitting an extra case fan like me, find that second fan extension cable and try to move it into a position where you can easily reach it later. Right, so now I'm going to prepare the fan for fitting it to the bracket and making sure it's facing the right way. I'm going to pre-tap these holes like we did before. You want to align the cable downwards when you're fitting it to this bracket, so it's just a shorter distance to reach the fan extension cable. And now just tighten up those bolts, but leave it a little bit loose so you can move it around, because you might want to change the position once it's in the case. Now when you place this bracket on, you can slide the fan around so you can make a final decision here. When you've decided where you want to put it, just tighten up a couple of the bolts and then take the bracket back off the case and tighten them all fully. So it's actually better to line the fan up with the big holes on the bracket. When I fitted it like this, I got a bit of turbulence, so I moved it afterwards. And now you want to fit the fan cable into the extension cable from the motherboard. Now, using the same bolts that you took it off, you want to just fit this side bracket back on. You can leave this off if you're fitting a GPU. At this stage I didn't have a GPU, so I'll be taking it back off to fit the GPU later. So I took this bottom grill off because I thought you needed to fit the fans, but you don't, so you can just leave this on. You'll be pleased to hear we're almost at the end of the build now, so we're going to get that power cable that we took off at the start of the build, and we're going to put it through this hole in the back of the case. Just make sure you got it the right way round, and then we're going to plug that into the power supply. I just turn the switch on the power supply as well here, and then we're just going to use the two bolts that we used to take it off at the start. And now the most important part of the build is obviously fitting the NCase M1 V6 badge back on. And don't forget to leave a big greasy fingerprint on the badge. Okay, the last thing and most satisfying part of the build is putting back on the dust filters and all the external aluminium panels. You can see here I'm routing some of those front I/O cables back into that little part behind the front cover. It seems to fit okay, so I think that's quite a good way of running those cables and keeping it tidy. And once you've fit all the aluminium panels and the bottom dust filter, you're ready to wait for your GPU to arrive. The NCase M1 build is almost finished. The last thing we're waiting for is a graphics card. The card that I ordered specifically, because it's an MSRP card, EVGA aren't really making it at the moment, so yeah, it's been over 2 months and I haven't got it yet. I bought a temporary card. The idea being add it into the system just to get the system up and running. I wanted to check everything else is working okay, so like the motherboard, CPU, which I bought secondhand, I wanted to check that was okay. Now, my idea was to move forward with this card. Magically, the 3070 and 3090 Founders Editions cards had a big drop. The 3070 was actually up for about an hour on the website. That redirects you to scan.co.uk, and I was able to get my hands on an RTX 3070. I had my heart set on an RTX 3080, but really an RTX 3070 is already, I mean, a 1060 3GB was lightning fast compared to what I was using before. So this is going to be like off the scale. Yeah, let's open it up. So when Jensen picked up this card, he said it's a work of art, and he's not lying. It's so nice as like just a piece of hardware, a piece of technology. It's like made of metal. The whole thing's made of metal. Everything you touch is made of metal. But yeah, super happy with this card. Yeah, really, really lucky to get it, and very excited to give it a go. Okay, once you have your GPU, you just take the right hand side panel back off, and you don't need to do this, but it makes it easier. I'm taking this fan bracket off, disconnect it, and try to leave the extension cable in a place where it's easy to reach once you've fitted the GPU, so I just stuck it up there. Now get the GPU, line it up with the PCIe slot and click it in place. Now you can attach it at the back side of the case. Founders Edition card comes with this 10-pin adapter for the PCIe power cable. So you want to attach that to the 3070 first, and then attach your cable and you're done. So this is my second build, my first build with a small form factor case and a dedicated graphics card. Stay tuned if you want to see how the 3070 performs in this case, and if the 3080 ever arrives. But thanks very much for watching, I'll see you next time.